There have been more scenes of violent protest in France today, but this time it's not President Macron's attempt to raise the pension age that's prompted the demonstrations. The thousands who gathered near Sainte-Soline in southwest France today are determined to oppose plans for a new water storage system they say favours large farms. But as police vans were set on fire and the authorities accused demonstrators of throwing molotov cocktails at security forces, once again it was anger at the authorities driving the protest. Earlier, I spoke to Sophie Pedder, the Paris bureau chief for The Economist and the author of Revolution Francaise, Emmanuel Macron and the quest to reinvent a nation. I asked her what was behind today's water protest.
Well, it's the creation of this mega reservoir, which is wanted by farmers and those who need water for the fields, and it is contested by environmentalists. But it has become extremely violent today, and that is, it's a very local issue that doesn't really affect anyone else in the country. But the scenes of violence have been really very shocking.
Yesterday it was pensions. Today the protest is supposedly about water. What is happening in France?
There's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of anger on the streets. I think sometimes it takes a trigger to bring that all out, and we've seen it. I mean, I think the main protest really remains about the pension reform. That's the one that concerns the whole of France. And it's very much personally directed at President Macron, who, under the French system, ends up sort of drawing all criticisms into him towards himself, and that I think is what we're looking at, is a kind of contestation of his government, his presidency, and the way he's been going about implementing his pension reform.
I mean, on the specifics of the pension reform, they were always going to be very difficult, insisting people work longer. But to many people, they make economic sense. You have an increasingly aging population. France spends a significant proportion of its GDP on pensions. Why isn't he able to make that argument?
Well, I mean, it's part of, I think, a kind of social belief in doing things differently in France. There is a tradition here of rolling back the amount of time that people spend in work. Don't forget, France introduced the 35-hour working week. And I think that a lot of the country, people feel that that's part of French civilization. It's having a strong welfare state, protecting people, and having a good sort of work-life balance. And therefore, the idea that you increase the number of working years is difficult to accept, and particularly when after COVID, when everyone's sort of reassessing their attitude to work more generally, it's been a particularly difficult case to make. But it didn't help that you have a president who doesn't have a minority. He runs a minority government, and therefore he's really trying to sort of push both against sort of cultural values and also against the political opposition, which just doesn't want this reform.
And you talked about the opposition. I mean, how are they making hay with this?
Yes, I mean, the opposition is split. That's one of the things that in a way makes the situation so unstable, because even if you were going to hold elections, suddenly dissolve parliament, that's an option in Macron's hand, and start all over again. You've got a big left-wing bloc, which is led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and you then have, the far right, Marine Le Pen's bloc. And there is no way that those two blocs are ever going to find an agreement between them. So it's very difficult to imagine where is the alternative majority. And that, I think, also is this is one of the difficult things that Macron has now got to think about when he looks at his options, one of which being dissolve parliament and hold fresh elections, which wouldn't actually necessarily help him at all.
And briefly, where do you think this goes? In terms of public support for the strikes, we see rubbish piling up on the streets, some fuel shortages. The government seemed to be hoping that public support for the protests will wane. Is that what you think will happen?
I think that the violence tends to be what changes public opinion. In other words, people don't like the way this is done. They don't like the protests, but they don't like it when it gets violent. And so if that continues, there is a chance that public opinion may begin to, diminish the sort of hostility to this reform. But we're not at that point yet. It's been pretty consistently against the reform, and I think we're looking at a few weeks of very, very difficult time for President Macron and for France generally.
Sophie Pedder, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.